Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's program. I'm Rebecca Allison, and I serve as Assistant Vice President for the Centers for Giving at Foundation for the Carolinas. We are so glad you're joining us, and we look forward to the conversation today. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them in the chat window, and we will answer them during a Q&A at the end of our session. Although by now we are probably all virtual meeting experts, a quick reminder to please ensure that your microphone is muted to help reduce any background noise during the presentation. If you experience difficulties during the session, please reach out to us for help via chat. Next slide, please. We are so excited to have local writer and editor Ken Garfield here with us today, and we'll get to hear from him in just a moment. But first, I am pleased to introduce two Foundation staff members, Emily Kennedy, Vice President of the Center for Personal Philanthropy, and Kendall Datar, Vice President of Planned Giving, who will review some of the considerations for your philanthropic legacy and how the Foundation can help. Next slide. Emily.
Thank you, Rebecca. Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Emily Kennedy, and I have the pleasure of leading relationship management and business development for the Center for Personal Philanthropy at the Foundation for the Carolinas. My role at the Foundation is to help guide individuals and families with their charitable vision. My team is here to provide you with tools and resources to increase the power of your giving and achieve a fulfilling, impactful legacy. As your community foundation, FFTC and its affiliate organizations, such as the Charlotte Jewish community, all play a unique and long-lasting role in connecting donors with their grant-making objectives. Over this long, challenging year, many of you may have been reflecting on your own story. Next slide, please. And how sharing your story with others will bring a fuller understanding of the reasons behind your charitable giving. Well, just as you take time to plan your giving, it is just as important to share your story as part of this planning. Consider that each time you make a charitable gift, whether that gift originates during your lifetime or takes effect after, you are demonstrating your values and providing a legacy. This legacy that you originate during your lifetime will serve as a guide for the next generation and thereafter of your values and vision. FFTC has engaged in thoughtful conversations with our donors for over 60 years, who trust their community foundation to honor the legacy they envision. As I mentioned, much of my work at the Center for Personal Philanthropy is working closely with fund holders on succession planning of their existing charitable assets. At FFTC, in the Center for Personal Philanthropy, we have over 1,100 donor-advised funds. Each fund is unique in that it is specifically tailored to the fund holder's intent. We encourage you to share your story. Your story will bring a fuller understanding of your legacy, and it may allow peace of mind to your successors when they are carrying out their own charitable endeavors. I will now turn it over to my colleague, Kendall Datar, who works closely with our fund holders on their planned gifts. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Again, I'm Kendall Datar, and I'll echo Rebecca and Emily in thanking you all for joining us today. So I'm pleased at the Foundation to work closely with many of our planned giving clients as they are considering and documenting additional gifts to come into their funds, either to new or existing funds at Foundation for the Carolinas. And as you'll see here, we have an estimated pipeline just north of $825 million of a collective planned gift pipeline. And that figure, I think, really demonstrates the collective generosity of this community and also, importantly, the really tremendous opportunity for impact here based on those gifts. So in working with our planned giving clients, we find that each gift is incredibly personal, and those gifts span really the full spectrum. And one of the benefits we believe in working with the Foundation is the ability to create a custom plan based on your sort of assets that you'd like to contribute, the structure of the gift and the funds you'd like to create, and ultimately, very importantly, the beneficiaries that you want to leave those gifts to support. Our job at the Foundation is to make sure that your plans are accurately and thoroughly documented so that in the future they can be fully honored. Next slide, please. So as we think about philanthropic legacy, we wanted to just distill for a moment the pieces that go into that, and you'll see represented on this graphic. So first, your gifts. And here, I think it's important to note that the foundation is able to accept a variety of assets and gifts any way that you might want to structure that. So still the most common gift is an outright bequest. That we also see a lot of activity in terms of retirement plans, which can be a very attractive asset for charitable giving. And then we also accept, more complex, so certain gifts of business interest or real estate. And it's worth emphasizing here that the ability to leave a philanthropic legacy is not reserved for those just with very, very large estates. So consider, for an example, a gift of $100,000 left to endow support for a specific organization would, assuming sort of a typical rate of investment returns and a payout rate, result in approximately a $5,000 ongoing support for that organization. So again, the options are open to many different folks here. Next, and this is where we spend a considerable amount of time in our conversations with clients, is the charitable intent. So as Emily highlighted here, the options are really wide open and driven very much by your personal passion. So perhaps you want to create an endowment to continue to support those organizations that you've already given to, or maybe where you served on the board. Maybe you want to create a scholarship that benefits your university or your college or even your high school. Maybe it is that you don't know exactly where you want your support to go, but you do know you have an overarching interest in a broad area. So perhaps education or the environment, animal welfare, or a specific county. In that situation, we have clients who entrust their funds to the foundation via one of our community impact funds to rely on the foundation's volunteer boards and staff to award those grants within that broad interest area based on the current needs and opportunities. Or perhaps you would like to pass on what we call a charitable inheritance. And that is so leaving the balance of your donor advised fund to future successor advisors, be those children or other family members or other selected advisors to maintain that charitable legacy. And frequently, I would say we're working with clients who may want to do some combination or all of those or something new. And again, the important piece here is we are here to serve your intent, whatever that is. And then, of course, importantly for today, the story part, which is what Ken is going to address expertly in just a moment. But again, I think we would emphasize here that in working with our clients on planned gifts, a lot of time the focus really is not on the technical aspects, although those are certainly important and we want to get that right, but really is trying to get into the story behind the gift. So why are these organizations important to you? How did you come to philanthropy? What do you hope your heirs might carry on there? And we think it's all of those together, your generosity, your charitable intent, your story that really comes together to create the philanthropic legacy. And as we think here about your story and the legacy piece, there's one point that we wanted to mention, and that is that clearly part of the goal here is to produce a document that will provide some context and guidance to those who are honoring your legacy in the future, and that is important. But we also hear frequently from clients that the process of documenting that legacy is joyful and of its own value in its own right. And so that is, the chance to take time, as Emily noted, maybe particularly in these challenging times, to reflect on your life and your thoughts about philanthropy and the organizations that have meant a lot to you, can produce peace of mind that your wishes will be well honored in the future. And importantly, to those who come behind you, to your successor advisors, the benefit of thoughtful legacy planning can be really important. So, these are successor advisors who, one, may not know all that you think that they know. That's important, right? To share that information, may not know about your family, your role in philanthropy, and the role that you hope for them to play in the future. And then it's important to share that information. And we think that does not only to educate them, but also to empower them to feel confident about their future role in that philanthropic legacy. So just to share two brief examples of some of the clients that we've worked with, we recently had a donor who had documented gifts, estate gifts to come in that will benefit certain nonprofits, but then also some of that will pass on via a donor advised fund to his children. And in documenting his gifts, he both spent the time on sort of the technical components of the gift, but also devoted a considerable amount of time to really a more narrative, very personal piece about why he had selected those organizations in his lifetime to support, what he hoped his children might do in the future, how he hoped they might find their own organizations that would be meaningful to them. And it's both parts of that then that are signed by the donor on file with the foundation. And then at that time, many years in the future, when those children take over that fund, will be passed on to them to help make sure they are able to honor that legacy. Additionally, one of our regional affiliate foundations was the recipient of an endowed gift some years ago. And in documenting the endowed gift there, although left some discretion for the board to determine the greatest needs of the community, the donor did leave some specifications about where she hoped the funds would be contributed. And so each year when that board meets to make their grant making decisions, they start by reviewing the documentation that she left word for word to make sure that they are honoring her intent in making those grant decisions. And so this is an instance where many of those board members never had the good fortune to meet this donor, but because of her generosity and her thoughtfulness in documenting her gifts, they are able to honor her legacy in their grant making. So again, just 2 examples of donors who have left generous gifts. We did want to note here in our work with planned giving donors, one of the tools that we are using, and that's our planned gift document. And here, next slide, if you could. I'm sorry, Linda. Thank you. These are just 2 pages from our planned gift document. And what we wanted to capture here is that in this document, we are trying to capture the full charitable legacy. So including, again, both the nuts and the bolts of the gift, all of which is important, but also really, as you'll see here on the capturing your story piece, trying to draw out the story, the motivations behind the gift. Where are you from? What brought you to this area? How did you get involved in philanthropy? Because we believe that it's all of that together that creates a full picture of our clients and their charitable goals, and ultimately helps us to better honor those gifts in the future. And then, Linda, next slide, please. We have here just a few examples of some of our generous planned gift donors who have shared their stories. And as you'll see here, consistent themes in each of these are family and place and gratitude for the good fortune that they have had in their own lives and their pride in being able to pass some of that on. So first, you'll see here longtime FFTC volunteer leader and fund holder, Bill Williamson, who has entrusted the foundation with a planned gift that will help address some of our needs and ongoing needs in the community. The next is Alice Williams Davis, who has established a planned gift in concert with her husband that will benefit in part our regional affiliate foundation in York County, so the York County Community Foundation. Of note here, Alice is the past board chair of that organization, and she's leaving a gift to benefit its future grant making. And then finally, we have Mark and Louise Bernstein, who have left legacy gifts to support the Jewish community and the Charlotte arts community. And their story is included as part of the Jewish community's Create Your Jewish Legacy initiative. So again, these are just a few examples of the storytelling featuring some of our planned gift clients. And I'd like to turn it over now to Rebecca Allison to highlight some additional tools.
So pictured here is a sampling of tools we might recommend to clients who are looking for ways to document their legacy. So on the left, the family diagram legend was created by 2164 for family members and their advisors who are interested in exploring family histories to gain insight into family dynamics today. At the top is the foundation's own resource, our Strategic Giving Guidebook, which is designed to help you, the individuals and families we serve, to achieve maximum impact through each stage of the giving journey, from evaluating current giving to creating a future legacy. Below that, The Wealth of Your Life by Personal Legacy Advisors guides users through the creation of legacy letters and ethical wills. And lastly, the Grandparent Legacy Project on the right is another 2164 resource for communicating legacy across generations. A list of these and some additional resources will be included with the materials we send out after the program. Next slide, please. At this time, I'm delighted to welcome the star of today's show, Ken Garfield. Ken has spent 46 years telling stories for newspapers, houses of worship, nonprofits, and others. Now on his own, he writes obituaries and biographies for individuals who wish to share their story with future generations. Most of his career was spent in newspapers, including 21 years with the Charlotte Observer, where he covered faith and values. Today, he writes for charitable causes, including Hospice, Memory and Movement Charlotte, and Sharon Towers. He also edited a book by Dr. Chuck Edwards titled Much Abides, A Survival Guide for Aging Lives. His wife, Sharon, owns Traditions at Park Road Shopping Center, which doubles as Ken's home office. They have 2 grown children and 4 grandchildren. Ken, welcome, and thank you for being with us today.
Oh, thank you, Rebecca. Hello, everybody. It's nice to quote unquote be with you. So I'm going to ask you to think of us meeting at Starbucks, maybe on the patio or around the table over a cup of coffee or on someone's patio, and just having the conversation on the most important thing there is in life, which is our story, our legacy. And so we're really having a cup of coffee and we're together. And I want to start by saying three things. Number one, we are talking about life, not death. We're talking about how we lived our lives in the short time that we have on this earth, what mattered to us, the good we might have done, our memories, our regrets, our joys. And ultimately, the question for all of us is this: what do we leave behind? So that's the context of what we're going to be talking about. Number two, another piece of the context is that storytelling is really becoming ingrained in our culture. Whether it's a business or a nonprofit, it's the Foundation for the Carolinas or a newspaper, it's all about telling people stories. It's not just about budgets and politics and achievements. It's about hearing about somebody's life journey and how it shaped them and how it shaped us. So we're talking about this in the context of really this is the moment where people are understanding the power of their stories and telling it. Third thing is I do a lot of workshops and people have so many questions. And before we're done, I want to make sure that I answer every one of your questions, either during our workshop time here or afterwards. If you don't feel comfortable sharing a personal question, the foundation will have my contact information. I'd love to talk to you and answer your questions, calm your fears, get you to think about your story more. So to begin, everyone has a story. I work in the back of my wife's furniture store, and if you hear a loud crash, that's probably someone dropping a sofa. But sometimes I'll come out and I'll run into someone I know from town in the furniture store, and we'll start talking. And my wife will see this, and she'll kind of nudge the person and tell him, Ken will talk to you forever if you let them. So I have a real eagerness to hear people's stories, and I hope you do too. It's not just about telling your story, it's about wanting to hear other people's stories. I always tell people about two national TV news features over the last few years. One was a TV station that would take a map of the United States, throw a dart at it, and whatever town it landed on, a reporter would go to that town and do a story. There was another TV station that would open a big city phone book. The reporter would close their eyes, point to a name, and do a story on that person. And the meaning of those two are very powerful and clear, that we all have wonderful stories to tell. And everything we do in life begins at the start of our journey. And so that's what we're going to talk about. So before we talk about the different ways and the opportunities to tell your story, let me just tell you a little bit about mine. I was born and raised outside New York City, the son of a Jewish optometrist, raised in a house of social activism. I have very rich memories of us gathering around the radio in the kitchen the night Martin Luther King was assassinated. Now, we had TV back then, but I have this very indelible image of us gathered around the radio listening to news of that tragedy. One of the things is that there are certain moments in our lives that stick with us and that are very important, and I have several. I remember one beautiful spring day in May of 1970. It was the day after my birthday, and my dad picked me up from wherever I was, and I got in the car, and he told me that 4 kids had just been shot at a university called Kent State. I'll never forget that and how that stuck with me. And I think that may be the seeds that were planted to focus my interest on loss. I've always been interested in loss. Interestingly, it's 50 years, 51 now, since the Kent State killings, and I've become friends and told the story of one of the kids who was shot there, where neither of us are kids anymore. But it all started on that spring day, one of those moments that stick with you. So I go off to college. The Kent State killing is what I ended up doing my senior thesis on. Woodward and Bernstein really shaped me. I'm one of those kids that were drawn to journalism by Woodward and Bernstein back in the day when people read and cared about newspapers. And so I immediately went into newspapers and spent 46 rich, wonderful years as a newspaper reporter, editor, columnist. My career started in a small upstate New York town and ended up taking us to Charlotte. where I covered faith and values, which really shaped my life. It was at the Observer covering faith and values when I started to think about kind of the more cosmic issues and what is more cosmic than life and death. So I started writing obituaries. I wrote famous people obituaries. I wrote Billy Graham's obituaries about a decade before he died. I like to tell people that that wonderful man outlived the newspaper company for which I wrote the obituary. He lived far longer than anyone thought, and we had his obituary ready the morning he passed away. I wrote George Beverly Shea's obituary. Everybody remembers the singer who sang How Great Thou Art. I remember they called me one Saturday morning at home. I was actually moving my son into his first apartment. And they said, George Beverly Shea is 99. He had a heart attack. You better get in here and write his obituary. I did that, and he died about 5 years later at about the age of 104. I also wrote Tammy Faye Messner's obituary, if anybody remembers Jim and Tammy, and I wrote that way in advance. Here's what I wrote. Tammy Faye Messner, whose can-do Christian cheer helped her survive the PTL scandal and forge a second career as a pop culture queen, died Friday after battling cancer for more than a decade. For Tammy Faye, like Elvis, no last name was necessary. So those were, I won't say fun to write, but those were kind of exciting and compelling to write. But I really felt drawn to writing obituaries for everyday people. I love the notion that in a couple of hours, I would try to capture a life in about 600 words, and that would go in the newspaper. And unlike almost every other newspaper story, someone would carefully cut that article out of the paper and wrap it in cellophane and put it in their memory box. And I took that responsibility very seriously. And so I felt drawn to write obituaries first for the paper. Actually, before I left the paper to go work at a church, I proposed doing the death beat. That I would be a reporter, like a reporter who covers basketball or government. I would cover death and dying. I would write about the rise in cremation. I would write about green sanctuaries. I would write about the interesting music that people want to have played at their funeral, including one I wrote about a gentleman who wanted them to play Prop Me Up Beside the Jukebox When I Die. So unfortunately, the newspaper editors didn't see the wisdom of creating a death beat. So I went off to a church, Myers Park United Methodist Church, to tell stories of people and ministries. As I did that, people kind of knew about my interest in writing obituaries, and I could see someone approach my door, and I could tell exactly by the look on their face and their crestfallen shoulders what they were there for. And they wanted me to write their obituaries. I will never forget, I wrote one for a family that had lost two children, adult children, to bone marrow cancer, and they had just lost their third child to bone marrow cancer. Husband and wife, they were in no condition to write Mary Margaret's obituary, so they asked me to do it. And again, moments. I remember them sitting in my little office on the sofa, and we got to the part where we list Mary Margaret's survivors. And the mother, the husband and the father had already been separated. Their marriage couldn't stand this tragedy. And the mother looked at me and whispered, "List my name first." And that was the kind of thing that showed me the power of telling a story, remembering a life. And so I took that very seriously. And then having an entrepreneurial spirit, when I went out on my own, even before I did, I started quote unquote business writing people's obituaries. And it has been really the honor and privilege of my life to do that. I tell people that if I was a real entrepreneur, I'd go on Shark Tank and try to publicize and get lots and lots more obituaries. But I'm very comfortable just having people reach out to me to tell their loved ones' stories. It may be their story before they pass. It may be a spouse or even a child. I've had so many different varieties of obituaries, and everyone ends up becoming almost like a morality tale, almost like a little piece of theater as I get involved in a person's life and in this family's journey. And so I want to talk a little bit about that in a minute. But that is only one way to tell your story. There are many other ways other than obituaries, but I kind of have become known around town as the obituary guy. I do about 25 a year. Typically, just referrals or word of mouth from retirement communities, churches, funeral homes. I work a lot with Ken Poe, a wonderful funeral home director here in town. And people just reach out to me, and it is an honor every time. And everyone is so different. Let me just share a couple of them, and then talk a little bit about the logistics of obituaries, and then share other ways that we can tell our stories, which may be more relevant to you in the foundation. I remember very early on at the church, Sandra Eubanks was a real saint of the church, a wonderful woman. You may know the family. And she had cancer for a long time and finally died. And they called me after her death, and we had a day or two to write the obituary. And I sat in their living room. They had 3 adult children, all very strong-willed and opinionated, all their spouses, and Sandra's widower, Tom Eubanks. And we all sat around the living room debating what mom would have wanted in the obit or not wanted in the obit. And it got a pretty lively debate. And I was sitting there listening to this, trying to navigate them. And I thought to myself, this is where God wants me to be. This is where God has called me to be, in the midst of heartbreak and tragedy, so that I could offer some comfort and consolation by telling this wonderful story. So from then on, everyone that comes to me is so interesting. I did an obituary on Jean Clarkson. Her son, John Clarkson, is a very well-known doctor here in town, president of the University of Miami Medical School. And I wrote Jean Clarkson's before she died. And I remember 2 things about that obituary. She had 28 grandchildren. I said, well, let's not list them all by name, or it's going to cost you a fortune. And the other thing is, Jean Clarkson used to brag how fast she could drive from Jacksonville to Miami until the family took the keys away. I'll always remember that line, and it kind of reflected her feisty spirit. I wrote Bob Culbertson's obituary. Used to be on school board here. Bob and Peggy Culbertson live at Sharon Towers, and I wrote his a long time ago. He is still living, and we sat at Panera on Providence Road and just talked about life, talked about his background, talked about his now late daughter, Ruth Samuelson. And it was a rich, engaging, lively conversation. And we got to the part about Bob's hobbies. And I said, Bob, what do you like to do? And I'll never forget what he said. He said this, meaning just having conversation with people, talking about the most important things in life. So I remember Bob Culbertson's. Many of these are very, very painful. Many of these are really tragic. Some people have me write them long before they're sick. I remember I got a call from Ken Poe to do an obituary for Max Justice. Max Justice was a very prominent lawyer in Charlotte who had recently retired. He was of counsel now in his law firm. And Max, one Friday night before they were having a dinner party, went into the bedroom and took his own life. And so I went over there the next day and sat at the dining room table with his grown children and his grieving wife. And we talked about Max and what a lively spirit he was, and what a wonderful father and lawyer, and talked a little bit about how he just couldn't adjust to a life in retirement. And so, because Max took his own life, we talked about what shall we say for the cause of death. So this is what we ended up writing in the paper. Max died by suicide. He had been struggling with depression. The family shares this in hopes it stirs others to share their mental health challenges and ask for help. It is a crisis for our times, one that needs to be brought out of the shadows. Maybe that can be part of Max's legacy. That was a year ago, and on the year anniversary of his passing, his daughter wrote me a note and thanked me for helping them begin to process this loss and how they lost their dad. And I saved those notes because that's why I do this, because I want to help people tell their stories, because there is a healing, cathartic nature in putting your life in words or in other forms. I did an obit of a lovely man named David Cribbs, who had a terrible bout with cancer before he died. And his nickname was Mr. Happy because he was always so cheerful. And I remember sitting with Dave and his wife, Barbara, in their home in Mountain Brook. We were talking about his obituary, and we were talking about the plans for the funeral and what we want to list in the obit. And his wife looked up at me and she said, I am having so much fun planning Dave's funeral. We all laughed, and then we all realized the message that she was delivering, the powerful thing she had just said, which is that sharing a life and then sharing a death is a powerful thing and a privilege. So she was having so much fun planning Dave's funeral. I did another one on a woman who is from Canada who I never met, who her son called me from Vancouver and wanted me to do Alice Dunwoody's obituary. So I did it. And she was a free spirit. And I put this in the obit. They used to call her Lucille Ball in the suburbs because she would pick up the TV remote control and put it to her ear and say hello until she realized it wasn't the phone. And that's why she was Lucille Ball in the suburbs. I never met the woman, never met the family, and was able to tell her story just by emails and phone calls. So obituaries, quickly, the way this works when I do an obituary, I have a form that I send to people, very basic biographical information, and then some deeper questions. What mattered most to you? What gave you joy in life? What are the moments you remember? What meant the most to you? So I say I get about a 50% return rate. Most people get a little bit intimidated when they get the form. They may just frankly be frightened to be writing about their life in this form. And so I work with those people. I'm patient with them. A lot of people do get them back very quickly. And then I will sit down with them either in person before COVID or by telephone or Zoom afterward. And we'll just have this wonderful conversation. And I can tell that everybody considers this just a privilege to be able to talk like this. So we work through all the issues that are involved in an obituary. So do you list your pet as a survivor? This is very important. At first, I used to say no, but then I thought to myself, how deeply a pet matters to a person who's alone, who lost a spouse, or is in a retirement community. So now I do include pets in the obituary. I tell people not to include the pet in the paragraph with the children, to give their pet their own one, their own paragraph. I talk about, we work through ex-spouses. I had one gentleman that was married 4 times and was now alone divorced. And I asked him, I said, which one of your ex-wives do you want to mention in the obituary? And he says the third one. Now that's kind of quirky, but the third one was the mother of his children. I've had others that have become friends with ex-spouses and list them in the obit. I have others who do not want their exes listed in the obituary. So we work through that. I did one on a couple at Cyprus. She was considerably younger than her husband. This was the 3rd marriage for each of them. And there were so many children and so many stepchildren, I think about 2 dozen. And the wife, whose husband was beginning to show signs of dementia, was so worried about how to list the stepchildren and the children. So I posed a simple question: do you love your stepchildren like they're your own? And she said, oh, absolutely. So then I said, we make no distinction. So we listed the stepchildren with the children. It's very interesting how people want to list how they passed. Did they die? Did they pass away? Did they go to be with the angels? I saw one the other day that said he went to be at the old fishing hole where he spent most of his life. Very interesting, says a lot about person. I typically will recommend passed away or died. A lot of people are pretty direct, and those are the words they want to use. Others want to express their faith or express the passion in their life and put that in how they died. So those are all things to work through. So I'd be glad to work with you. I'm working with 2 or 3 now. And what I find in these obituaries is that your life isn't your career. It isn't all your achievements or your civic clubs or how many banks you work for. Your life is who you loved, how you loved. It's what you did on this earth to help others. It's how you related to your neighbors. It's how you related to God. And those are the things that I think we want to emphasize both in an obituary as well as in a story. Very important to focus on those most important things. I try to take out when people want to list their vacation homes or their country club affiliations or even their civic affiliations, because that's not what a person was. Remember that as you consider writing your story. It's your legacy, your passion, what inspired you to launch a fund through the foundation. It's all those sorts of things. So many memories. I remember Skip Gribble. We met at Brugger's, and he had pancreatic cancer. And as we went over this, he said, "Please don't tell my wife that I'm doing this," as it was too painful for her to know. I did family court judge Jim Lanning, who was a lovely man, who came into Brugger's with his oldest son pulling his oxygen tank because he was in his last days. It's just an honor and a privilege to do these as well as to tell stories. So you want to tell your story, whether it's in an obituary or some other form. You want to do this for your spouse, for your children, especially for your grandchildren, that your story isn't lost with the passage of time. So one thing I ask people to do, I did this at a writing workshop at Sharon Towers. Think about summing up your life in 6 words. I had a wonderful observer editor who said every story could be summed up in 6 words. So think about that. What are the 6 words that sum up your life? Second exercise is, what was a turning point in your life? What moment just changed everything or made things clear for you? Make that the lead to the story of your life. You're going to write your biography, and you're going to write the lead on the turning point in your life. So I asked that at Sharon Towers, and one very sweet, she was in her 90s lady, wrote that as a child, she had dyslexia, and the other children made fun when she was called on in class to read out loud, and she became a reading teacher. At one moment as a child, set her course for the rest of her life. She became a reading teacher. So try those 2 exercises and see what you come up with. 6 words sounds hard, but I think you can do it, because again, it's those moments that really shape a life. That moment when my dad told me about the Kent State killings, and I set out on a journey of writing and storytelling and focusing on loss. So think about that. So now, besides obituaries, the revolution in technology has offered us a lot of different ways and alternatives to tell our stories. I think obituaries are a common one because we're capturing and summing up a life, and because you have quote unquote deadline. You have to get something into the paper when someone passes away or on the funeral home website. So I think that's kind of one of those assignments that has a practical nature to it that must be done. And so I think that's one way to do it. There are lots of other ways. I think more and more people are intent on writing their biography. I know my dad died in his 80s about a decade ago, and he had written his biography in longhand on a legal pad just because he wanted to get his story down on paper. There's a wonderful man in town named Larry Farber, who's a music promoter who started a wonderful concert series in town, runs a jazz club. He's brushed shoulders with James Taylor and Aretha Franklin, all these famous people. They just celebrated the birth of their 3rd grandchild, Sam, and that has inspired him to want to get his story on paper. So Larry and I are going to tell his story on paper, not to sell 1 million books, but just so his family and his friends and his neighbors can know the story of what music meant in his life. My brother just turned 75 in upstate New York, and because of the pandemic, we couldn't be together. And we were trying to think of a way to honor his 75th birthday. So our family came up with the idea. We produced a video, 4 or 5 minutes, that celebrated my brother Gary's life. And my son's a wonderful filmmaker. And so we collected a lot of old pictures. We poured through boxes in the closet and got together old pictures. We had all our cousins shoot and then email us a short video about what my brother has meant to them. We set it to music and we sent it to him. And he has a 4-minute story of his life from childhood. There's a beautiful picture of him as a 2-year-old kissing my father in 1948 up to the present day. And you can do that. I bet you all have a grandchild or a son or a daughter who is great with video. It might be a wonderful way to tell your story. Some people want to write books. Rebecca mentioned Dr. Chuck Edwards, who many of you probably know. He founded Memory and Movement Center to treat dementia. Well, he had all these things that he wanted to say about how you live with dementia, how you find meaning and purpose in your later years, but it really all started with his story. So if you read the book that we put out, he tells his story at the start, and that catapulted the rest of the book. And his story is he was an accomplished heart surgeon, and one day in surgery, his assistant looked at him and said, "Doctor, your right hand is shaking." And he has a tremor to this day. And that was the moment that changed his life. He went back and educated himself on dementia care and now treats people at this wonderful nonprofit. So if you have it in you, you can write a book. Videos are huge now, not just celebratory videos, but sitting people down and having them tell their story on video. Most of you will know Schindler's List, the amazing movie that Steven Spielberg made about the Holocaust, and Alexander Schindler, who saved many lives. Out of that came the Shoah Project, in which Spielberg has done interviews with hundreds of thousands of Holocaust survivors all around the country. These videos are stored at University of Southern California, and it's just Holocaust survivors and their families sitting down, telling their journey, their story, so that they will never be forgotten. So there's video. I bet we all have Shutterfly or photo books that we get at Christmas from our kids about the beach trip or, the birth of a grandchild. What about putting together a photo album through Shutterfly, perhaps, that has words, content that tells the story of your life? How much fun would that be? Again, recruit a more technologically savvy grandchild or child to put this together with you. So many ways to preserve your story that there's really no excuse if you have the spirit and if you feel called to do that. So let me stop there and see if there are questions. And I want to end with a couple of more things, but let's stop there and see if there are questions. Rebecca?
Ken, I see one question. I'll just start with this one. How do you broach the topic of getting parents or grandparents, if they're aging, to get started on this? It's somewhat delicate. How does one go about actually broaching the topic?
I'll answer that broadly in this way. When I was at the paper, you would often have to go interview people who have just lost a loved one in a newsworthy way, a murder, a plane crash, a car crash. And it is amazing to me how cathartic and healing, even in moments of grief, people find talking about their story, talking about their loved ones. I've almost never been turned down by someone who is given an opportunity to talk about their loved one. You have to do it sensitively. You have to be respectful. But I think the same applies in an obituary. I think people are almost eager to tell their story. So I do probably 60% of these obituaries before the fact. Sometimes someone gets a bad diagnosis, someone is in hospice, sometimes someone is 57 and they plan ahead. So we write it and they put it with their will and they don't use it for 25 years. Others are after the fact, and I've written them in an hour because they had to get in the newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
So I think people should not be intimidated if it's for a loved one, and they should not be intimidated themselves, because I think people embrace the opportunity to do that. I think maybe one exception is my mother, who I wrote hers when she was on her deathbed, and I said, "Mom," I called her up in Florida. I said, "Do you want to read this?" And she said, "No, no part of it." But I think that's kind of the exception.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I think that leads into a second question is, do you recommend that people share their obituaries with their family members if they've written it?
Question. Most of the people do share it. They get a child or a spouse to read it, make changes. Most do if they have a loved one that's available. Some don't, just do it themselves. But yes, and it becomes part of the healing process, especially if it's after the fact or near the end. It becomes a wonderful part of the grieving journey.
Mm-hmm.
It's something people can share.
Very good. And then another question came in. You had mentioned 600 words, but how long should an obituary be? Is there a set number of words, or how does that work?
Great question. Great question. So obituaries traditionally have appeared in your local newspaper. Newspapers, as they were losing money to the internet, got smart, started charging for obits by the line, by the word. And so the longer it is, the more you're going to pay. Obituaries can run up to $2,000 to run once. When my dad died, he was an optometrist in New York City. We wanted an obituary, a mention in the New York Times. So we wrote this much, if you all can see that, and it came in at about $1,500. So my sister ordered me to write that much. So I tell people to be respectful of your inheritance. Don't leave it to the newspaper, leave it to your children. That's if it goes in a newspaper. So 600 words to me, if you've lived a full and a good and a meaningful life, 600 words is a good length to capture that life. Many people now are running something very short in the paper that has a link to the funeral home website where the obituary is free. Now, if you do that, know that you're going to have less readers, because I don't know how many people are going to click on the link and then go to that website and find the obituary on the funeral home website. But that is another way in which you can write as long as you want. I also tell people that if you include every civic club, every job you had, every trip you took, people are going to miss the forest for the trees, if that's the expression. They're not going to get to the essence of you with all this resume stuff in there. So that's another reason to keep it short.
We just had one question about, can you change your succession plan or plan gift? That would be more of a foundation question. And yes, we do have forms. You can change your succession plan or your plan, the succession plan for the plan gift. That's something that we review with people at least once a year or whenever they want to. That was more of a foundation question. I know you had some more things to talk about.
Yes.
Ken, that you want to touch on before we end?
A very interesting part for me is when people want to choose a memorial gift in somebody's honor. I always walk people through that very carefully. Many have not even thought about it. And so they'll say, well, so-and-so love pets, let's give to the ASPCA. Really, that's not a very appropriate charitable organization to give to. So I recommend people to think about that. Now, maybe the ministry that you started through the foundation is where you want your gifts to go. But be very specific. If you're choosing a church, choose the Sunday school class, the music ministry, so it doesn't go in the general operating fund. Always include a website and an address. So don't make people, before they write their check I'll give online, have to go search it out. Always include that. It's always an interesting conversation to me to see what people cared about. Also recommend no more than listing 2. This seems like that gives people an option. One of the things I wrote my mom's before she passed, she was 89. And 2 things I want to share about this. Again, a moment in life. I'm 68, so I spent 67 years with my mom, and there's a lifetime of activity and accomplishment and meaning. But again, it's that one moment, that image, that snapshot. And what I thought about is I was the 3rd child, and when I left for college is when they really started enjoying life because they didn't have to worry about the kids. They moved to Manhattan. They worked together in Dad's optometry practice, and they had a wonderful life. And there are 2 ways I knew that is because when I would come visit, I would see their wonderful life. And the other thing is when we were choosing a picture, we couldn't find a picture of them without a martini in their hand. We had to crop out the martini. I think my mom was whiskey sour. And that reflected, they just had a good life. They had a million friends. They enjoyed each other's company. They found joy. And so I put this in my mother's obituary. What a life they enjoyed, working together, sharing a quiet dinner at day's end, then returning home to the New York Times and TV news. I'll just never forget that image which to me reflected the goodness of my mother's life. The other thing I wanted to say in this obituary is my brother's a physician. She died at 89 at home, at peace, no pain. My brother, the physician, kept saying, you know, it's a blessing, let's not cry about it. And so I wanted to capture words that you could use in an obituary for your loved one, that whether someone is 62 or 102, there's a grief. And so I wrote, there is deep thanks for the 89 years that Jean Garfield was here, and comfort that her passing came at home free of pain. What's sad is that she is gone, and the life she enjoyed before she took ill couldn't have gone on just a while longer. Each one of these is to me a morality story, a piece of theater, getting to tell someone's story, to sit with them in their home, with their loved one in a hospice unit over coffee at Panera is a privilege for me. To see people's eyes light up when they get to tell their story, when they get to relive memories and talk about the most important things and what really drove their life, what they want people to remember about them. It's a thrilling experience for them. And you asked about whether that's hard, and it is, but we're all gonna need this at some point. And I think people understand that and embrace the chance to do this when they're of sound mind and sound body and sound heart.
I do think that's so important. And we had another question. This is more for the foundation, but with what do I do if I want to have multiple grown children advised on a succession plan? And yes, at the foundation, we have, we customize that so people can have more than one grown child be a successor advisor. But Ken, going back to you and your story, I'm so curious. Have you written your own obituary?
Oh, everybody asks me that. It's in my head.
Very good.
And I'm a very fast writer. You know, we have happened to have had a lot of loss in our family in the last few years, and of course, it falls to me to write my mother-in-law, my brother-in-law, and my other brother-in-law, and you know, it's a way that I can honor them. And so, you know, I have those in my head, and, you know, I do have mine in my head. And, you know, I'm going to put it in my will wherever that might be.
Sure. And how has this, your choice of work now, how has that impacted your life? I mean, you have such wonderful stories, and I was taking so many notes on what you were saying, because I think it's so helpful for anyone at any age, whether you have aging parents or really any age. So have you seen how this is, can you share with us how your choice of work has impacted your life?
Yes, it's, you know, I have 40 some odd years in newspapers and storytelling, and this last year, storytelling on my own has been the greatest honor of my life, not because of I don't have a boss or whatever. It's because there are so many amazing stories. In the last 3 weeks, I wrote a story about a nurse at a Novant Health clinic in Winston-Salem who sings hymns to her patients who are nervous. And she got an elderly Black woman who was terrified of needles. And as she's giving her vaccine, she's singing a hymn to her. And when it's all done, the two of them sing together. We're in the middle of March Madness, and I happened to read something about, if you remember basketball or no basketball, in 1977, UNC Charlotte made the Final Four, and it was Charlotte's greatest sports memory. The coach from that era was Lee Rose, a lovely guy, had a distinguished career. I happened to read that he has Alzheimer's. And I'm writing a story that during March Madness, he can remember very little about the years of his glory. So I'm just writing about how his life now is sitting at the kitchen table, watching the birds outside his window. There are so many wonderful stories, Larry Farber stories. He was promoting the concert with James Brown, the Godfather of Soul, and he went up to his room to give him the check for the concert, and James said, cash only. And so we had to go find about $75,000 in cash in about an hour, else the concert was going to be off. Just All you got to do is talk to people and you will see a story. And if you're a writer like me, the light bulb will go off. That little red light will go off and you say, I've just got to tell that story.
Well,
First
thank you.
Presbyterian church downtown, 100 back in the Civil War, the white members would bring their slaves to church. Those slaves and the descendants of their slaves broke off and formed First United Presbyterian Church downtown, about 2 blocks away. Well, 160 years later, the members of those two churches, descendants of slaveholders and descendants of slaves, are going to worship together at Easter. Those are the stories that drive me, and that I hope drives the reader. But I hope that everybody listening today will have this drive them to think about their stories, forgotten or remembered, and put them on paper or on video or in a photo album. That's the whole point.
Well, thank you, Ken. We're so thrilled that you were able to be with us today and share this with everybody. And I see we're just about out of time, and I just wanted to say, please know that the foundation really appreciates the generosity of our donors, and we'll work diligently with you to document your intent, as well as the succession plan for your gifts. And I hope that you all are inspired with Ken's talk today, and will be encouraged to tell your own story. So I think
I finally found my quote. I said I was going to miss it. Can I just end with one quote to leave by?
Yes,
this is from Maya Angelou, the wonderful poet and civil rights activist. Maya Angelou once wrote, "There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you." How about that for inspiration?
That's very inspiring. Thank you very much. I think we're out of time now. We really appreciate everybody joining us, and we thank Ken Garfield and Kendall Datar and Rebecca Ellison at the foundation, and also Linda Nelson for helping behind the scenes with the video. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.